Hello everyone, my name is Protesilaos, also known as Prot. Today I want to do something that I don't usually do, which is to just talk to you about a topic that is of interest to me and I think you will find useful as well. And that is moral lessons from switching to Emacs. And basically this will be the lessons that I have drawn from my experience as a computer user. And this is a topic that comes up from time to time in private email exchanges. People ask me about my background, and so I tell them and how I ended up in Emacs and that sort of thing. So the story itself may be interesting, but I think what is more useful, what can be didactic, is the lessons that we draw from it rather than the story itself. So I want to share with you what I have prepared today. This is a presentation that I have written in org mode, so it's plain text, and the text itself will be available below, it will be available rather on my website where I will post the video. I will post the text of the presentation below the video. So if you are watching this on the video hosting platform, I will add a link to my website in the description from where you can get all of this. So I want to start right away and basically turn on my presentation mode that I have and start talking about my experiences with computers and the moral lessons we can learn out of them in the process. So let's begin. I did not have a computer growing up. I first started using one when I went to university and I had to prepare all my homework, all my assignments in either doc or PDF format. Usually it was doc format that I would just print out. So this started in 2006 and was the case for all my years at the university. So I would have to visit the computer lab at the university and type in what I had prepared at home. I had written it by hand and I would go to the lab to type it in and then print it out so that it was nice and tidy for the professor to accept it. Back then my typing skills were rudimentary and extremely clumsy, so I would have to use my index fingers and I would have to type like this, and I was also looking at the keyboard to make sure that I was not missing the keys. It was a very slow and awkward process, but anyway, how it worked, I got my degree, but still it was nothing to be proud of. So even though I didn't know anything about computers, I had this interest in publishing my work online. I wanted to share my essays with the world and my blog posts and whatnot. So in 2011, I managed to set up a blog. At that time, it was on the Blogger platform. Eventually, it evolved into the statically generated website that I have nowadays. But at the time, it was just a blog on Blogger, and I would post there. I would also do that from the computer lab of the university. So yeah, basically that was my computer knowledge at the time, close to zero. So after university, I had a job at the European Parliament, so I moved to Brussels, Belgium. This was in 2012, and there I had to use a computer at the office for practically every single task. So every day of the working week, I had to use the computer to get things done, and this involved all sorts of writing. It had to do with preparing briefings on policy matters, writing amendments in the lawmaking process. You know how that is, preparing amendments for legislation, editing other people's work, and so on and so forth, dealing with email. You get the idea. It doesn't really matter. The technicalities don't matter. What matters is that I was using the computer at work full time. So at some point we were away from the office, and I needed to use a colleague's laptop. I did not have a computer of my own. I did not have a laptop or an iPad or that sort of thing. So I asked my colleague whether I could borrow their laptop to type in a briefing that I had to send via email. And they gave it to me, the laptop. And at some point, I had to use two apps. I had to jump between two programs and copy text from the one to the other and back and forth. So at the time, I didn't even know how to use a trackpad, you know, the trackpad on the laptop. So I was doing this awkward process of slowly nudging the pointer towards the one app, then hitting the click to focus it, then hitting right click and select copy, go to the other app very slowly, right click, select paste, and back and forth. You can understand how tedious that was. So my colleague noticed my trouble over there. I was almost sweating, as it were, and they told me, why aren't you using Alt-Tab? And I was surprised. I was like, okay, what is this program, and how do I enable it? I want to use the Alt-Tab thing that you are alluding to. And basically they showed me that you press Alt and then the Tab key, and magic happens. Because that was the impression I had at the time. It was a revelation, because I realized that, oh look, you can use the keyboard, the same instrument that you use to type in. You can also use it almost mechanically to also control the computer, so you can work faster. And I was thoroughly impressed. And then shortly thereafter, I asked what are the other common shortcuts, and eventually I learned about Control-C, Control-V, you know, all those common shortcuts. And I started using those. So the first lesson from this experience is that when you have no access to learning resources, when you are not exposed to a superior paradigm or to a method that is more refined than what you currently implement, than what you currently follow, you are always trapped in a cycle of self-deprecation and perceived powerlessness. Humans are good at rationalizing their own condition. We are great at that. So we can always come up with plausible explanations. So we are trying to make it sound logical. We try to think that the way things are is because this is how they are meant to be. They are that way by necessity. So one such explanation is, oh, my manual dexterity is not good enough, you know, I am clumsy or whatever. Or even the more preposterous claim that it actually helps me write better. This slow process is more deliberate, so I can think about it more. And it's ridiculous, of course, you know. It doesn't work that way. Knowledge or a means of learning is key to emancipate yourself from your own inadequacies. Never make excuses that hinder your potential to learn something new. Always keep an open mind. So this is the first lesson from my early years of adulthood and when I first started using computers. So the second lesson before the transition to free software. I was eventually granted a laptop at my work. It was a MacBook Pro of some sort, though I don't know the model. I didn't know anything about its specs. For me, it was just a computer that I could take at home, and this was a big step forward because I could finally interact with the computer outside the confines of university work and then office work. So I finally had some room to experiment and to grow as a computer user. So I started personalizing my computer experience over time. Of course, that being a Mac, you know that personalization is not the same as what we get in the GNU/Linux space, but it was still good enough for me at the time. So it practically meant that I was buying various apps that were supposed to help me boost my productivity. So I was all into this idea that now that I have a computer, I must make good use of it. So now I have to become productive, finally. And this is when the next set of post hoc rationalizations started to kick in. It started developing. Because I was deluding myself into thinking that my efficiency up to that moment was not good enough. And I needed some app, some program that I had to buy to fix the problem. And this is how I would maximize the potential of the computer. It did not, and it could not. And this is something that relates to Emacs as well. There is no magical way to boost your productivity by changing the software you use, while keeping your mindset constant. And this is the key. To become productive, you have to identify the patterns in your workflow that hamper your output, those things that hold you back. You have to remove them in order to improve your output. Apps are tools that you use. And the same, of course, is true for Emacs, which, despite its extensibility, despite its self-documenting nature, its programmability, all those virtues that I have exalted in some and have praised in some other videos, even Emacs can neither read your mind nor, more important, reprogram it. It all starts with your mentality and with how you opt to conduct yourself. It is up to you. I had thus wasted a fair bit of money on those shiny apps that claim to fix my perceived problems. And now, in retrospect, I would speculate that the absence of tools for self-learning that is prevalent in the proprietary app ecosystem conditions users, perhaps inadvertently, though that is another discussion, into not questioning things and into conforming with the status quo. We are all different, and this means that what works for one person may not apply to another. Thus, a user who is not offered genuine alternatives, a method that helps them decide for themselves, is eventually led to rationalize their condition as a fault of their own. Because this is what happened to me. I bought those apps for productivity, but I did not really change anything in my life. So, the rational mind kicks in. I thought to myself that the real reason for not being productive is because of my awkwardness as a computer user or something silly along those lines. So the second lesson I learned, and I learned that the hard way, is that you must always assess someone on their own merits. Do not judge people for trying and failing to meet some other person's standards. And extended to computers, or if you will, to life in general, do not fall into the trap of the so-called TINA, which is an acronym for there is no alternative. There always are alternatives, always, provided you change your mindset and stop internalizing your induced victimhood as some supposedly intrinsic quality of yours, as something that has always been there by design in your very nature. It is not your fault. The third lesson after switching to GNU/Linux. So in 2016, I still had that MacBook laptop, but I finally decided in the summer of 2016 to switch to free software. I had read about Linux, Wikipedia entries or whatnot, and learned that it was Unix-like and all those other things, though I did not understand what any of that meant. It was too far removed from my knowledge at that time. Instead, what helped me get started, what helped me understand the concept of free software was the GNU image manipulation program. A program which is very good, by the way, but however goes by an unfortunate acronym, alas. Anyhow, I will not say what the acronym is, you probably know about it, but anyhow, I installed the GNU IMP on my laptop because I wanted to do some basic image editing. Of course, I was not a pro, this was the first time that I was doing such a thing, so I thought, why buy another one of those shiny apps that anyway don't work for me, instead of trying this free of cost software that I just found on the internet. Let's give it a try. So I installed it and it worked, and I was surprised because I was still thinking at the time that free software was just freeware, so free of charge. And the reason I was surprised was, one, because it worked, and two, because it did not spam me with ads, or it did not prompt me to install some shady tracking system, you know, all those spurious tools that exist out there. It was just a tool to get things done, and I really appreciated that, and I was really impressed by it. So I thought to myself, let's go check the website of those fellows. I thought it was some company that was doing it. So let's go check their website, because maybe they have other products as well. So I would like to use those as well. Eventually that led me down the rabbit hole of free software, so I began to check all those other tools, and I was like, okay, there is a bit of everything here. I think we are good to go. My needs are very simple. All I want to do is write. I think I can write on a GNU/Linux device, no problem, no stress, so let's do it. So I decided to install Linux Mint on the MacBook, and this happened in the summer of 2016. Linux Mint is a very good distro in its own right. It was back then, and I think it still is today. However, I did not like it for one specific reason, because it was too close to what I was already doing, so it was giving me a false sense of comfort. I was not being forced to learn. I was rather reverting back to some prior state of familiarity and false sense of security. So I decided, you know what, let's go with Arch Linux. I read the wiki, I think I understand what it is saying, and the worst thing that can happen is that I will install Linux Mint again. So I installed Arch Linux, I followed the wiki and whatever I could find online. It worked. I did not understand those commands at the time. I did not know what any of that meant. Why would I have to do partition manually or mount the file systems? You know, if you have ever installed Arch Linux, you know how it is. By the way, it is very easy to install. I did it 1.5 years ago. I did it again, and it was ridiculously easy, and I was like, how come I thought it was more difficult, but maybe it's because I have learned how to read the docs. Anyhow, this is not about the distros in the Linux in the GNU/Linux space. This is just how I got started. So let's move from moving towards free software helped me change my life for the better, because it put me in a course of escaping from heteronomia in Greek. And this means rule by another. It is the antonym, the opposite of autonomy, which means rule by oneself. And of course, these apply to collective magnitudes as well. So the heteronomy of a society and the autonomy of a society, of a people, and so on. Anyhow, my time buying apps for the Mac was one of heteronomy, not only because I did not control the software, but mostly due to the mentality that is associated with using tools that you do not understand, because that is the key point. You are always dependent on someone else. You are trapped in that cycle of powerlessness and victimhood that I alluded to earlier. So the third lesson is that autonomy comes at a cost. It presupposes responsibility, and that is predicated on discipline. So of course the cost in my case was that I have to get out of my comfort zone, and I have to be prepared to deal with whatever breakage in installing Linux Mint, in installing and setting up Arch Linux, in learning about all those things. So I had to assume responsibility. I did not have to let someone else do that for me. If you do not want to be responsible, if you prepare to be spoon-fed what life has to offer, then you will remain in a state of heteronomy with all its fake comforts. This is not about the Mac per se, or Windows, or whatever. No, this is about understanding your system. This is about knowing how it is pieced together and being in a position of control. And this is not always an absolute, by the way. When I talk about autonomy, I do not mean absolute autonomy. You don't go from absolute heteronomy to absolute autonomy in one go. We have to think in relative terms, and we have to always bear in mind that the ideal must serve as a guide for the good. So what we have now, we must nudge it, we must move it towards the ideal, and never use the ideal as an enemy of the good. You must never say, oh, what I have is not perfect, therefore I have to discard it. No, that is wrong. What you have may not be perfect, but it can be iterated upon, it can be improved upon, and you have the ideal as your guide. So that is the basic idea. So here I must stress, because I mentioned discipline, I must stress that discipline is not the same as conformity with the established order. No. Discipline is a virtue. It is about overcoming your pernicious rationalizations, what I mentioned earlier as well. Those that keep you trapped in a state of perceived helplessness. Sorry about that. It is about deciding to be in charge of yourself and being prepared to deal with the challenges from a position of control. And again, from a position of control in relative terms, from a better position compared to what you had before. It is not about absolute control, okay? So discipline is about adding structure to a theretofore chaotic life. Never mistake conformism or obedience with virtue. So, the fourth lesson that brought me to GNU Emacs. I had not fully understood the third lesson of autonomy even after I had switched to GNU/Linux, because I retained one very bad habit from the old days. I was not reading the wealth of documentation on offer. Instead, when I had a problem, I would search the web for some quick and easy fix, copy and paste it, and move on to the next task, and then repeat the cycle. So this mentality, because that's in your mind, held back my potential. I was still behaving heteronomously, and I was still rationalizing it. This is too difficult for me. This is not something I can do on my own. I was just doing politics. I studied in the humanities, in the liberal arts. How am I supposed to know anything about computers? That is nonsense. It is a mindset that sets you up for failure. What made me change my habits was the realization, and that was a major turning point in my life, that there is no cheat code, no secret life hack to gaining expertise in any given field. You have to earn it. And this means that you have to put some serious effort into it. I understand how people feel for finding themselves in such a predicament. I was just like that until not too long ago, until a few years ago. Just look around you. The zeitgeist, the general spirit of the times, is to do things quickly, where quickly is mistaken for doing them well. So the common example is some formulaic video tutorial that promises to make you a pro in 5 minutes. Here are 10 tricks to be happy. Or take this one ingredient and you will become an elite athlete in 1 month. Something silly like that, something totally unrealistic like that. We can discern the same pattern in the Emacs space. You must have noticed this type of post where someone jumps onto a forum and claims that they finally want to switch to Emacs, but they do not want to lose any of their productivity. To me, that only shows that they do not understand what they want to do. They have been led to believe in this narrative of the quick fix, the secret life hack, the one magic thing that provides a shortcut, a conduit to wisdom, and so on. There is none of that. It is all a lie. You are chasing chimeras. As for Emacs in particular, you simply, as I have said in a previous video, you simply cannot be an Emacs tourist. It does not work that way. It will never work that way. You will always fail to get into Emacs if you have the mentality of a tourist. You cannot spend a weekend in Emacs. To learn your way with free software and to gain expertise in general, you must commit to it with an open mind. This means that you must have already prepared yourself mentally, which implies that you are willing to forego some short-term loss in productivity in pursuit of a longer-term transition to a more autonomous way of living, to a more autonomous modus vivendi. So when you go and ask how to switch to Emacs, you will have to say, I am ready to lose some productivity and now and therefore I can switch to Emacs and I will eventually pick up after a few weeks or months depending on how much you commit to it. So that would be the right mindset. So the fourth lesson I learned is to be modest, patient, persistent, and courageous. In the free software space, this set of virtues boils down to a simple yet critical instruction. Read the documentation and be methodical about it. Don't entertain unrealistic expectations of doing it in 5 minutes or over the weekend or by just watching that one video or by reading that one blog post. There is no magic solution. You have to take your time. You have to read and read and read and proceed slowly, one step at a time, from the basics to the advanced issues. That's how you develop expertise in everything in life. And this, of course, applies to free software in general and Emacs in particular. So the fifth lesson after switching to GNU Emacs. So I became an Emacs user in the summer of 2019, while I had bought my first computer in 2018. And that is the ThinkPad X220, which is what I am using now. The ThinkPad is over here to my left, and over here I connected with an external monitor. So this is basically my desktop, but it is of course a laptop, but I am using it as a desktop at home. So anyhow, when I switched to Emacs, I started from scratch. No configuration whatsoever. I didn't follow the easy road, the supposedly easy road, because then you have all sorts of questions. It's never easy when you install someone else's config. So I start from scratch, I read the manual, and I gradually work my way towards becoming familiar with the way Emacs works, and eventually arriving at where I currently am. I am not a programmer. I have mentioned this several times, though this is not an excuse. I do not mean to say it as an excuse. It is just a matter of fact, because I was involved in, I studied in the humanities, I was working in politics, so I had no notion of programming or related fields in STEM, you know, science, technology, and whatever, mathematics. So I was none of that. So this is a matter of fact. But it also, when I say that I am not a programmer, it also is a statement of intent, where I mean that I want to continue improving on what I do. I want to continue experimenting with Emacs Lisp. I want to learn more. I want to be better, and I will not be satisfied with mediocrity, and I will not tell myself all those, again, those rationalizations. Oh, but you are not a programmer. Don't worry about it. That's an excuse. Anyhow, I don't want to bother you with my musings in the Emacs space, with my projects in Emacs. Those are chronicled, among others, in all the videos that I have published over the last almost 2 years. And of course, you can always find more information on my website. My website is not specifically about Emacs. I have been writing since 2011 on a variety of topics. But maybe you only care about Emacs, so there is a lot about that as well. So anyhow, I want to focus on a general theme now, which I think hints again at heteronomy, again at this rule by another, which in this case is the self-description that many of us in this space have of the geek or the nerd. Now I understand that those terms are used in a positive sense. You put a positive spin to them, though I am still not amused. I am not happy with them. My problem comes from the dichotomy they assume, where on the one side you have the normal users, the normies, and on the other side you have the cool people, the geeks, the nerds. So my experience as a computer user, what I have already talked about, tells me that there is no such binary. There is a spectrum of possible combinations and permutations in between the extremes, as is, of course, the case with practically everything in life. Plus, I am not convinced that normal, as in normies, mean what we want. Normal signifies the norm, the common pattern, though it can also hint at normativity in the form of an exhortation, a moral instruction. This is how you should behave. So that is an exhortation. I object to such false morality because in the computer it translates into people should remain trapped in arrangements they do not control and in which they are utterly powerless to enact reform. So that is what the normativity means when it comes to the normies in the computer space, to keep them in a position of powerlessness. I transcended those fake constraints. And I believe that everyone can do the same if only we show them the way. Maybe they will discover it on their own, as it was with my case. But perhaps I was lucky. Perhaps it happened to me that way because I didn't have a computer at home. Or perhaps because I grew up in an era where the computers were a bit more open. I don't know. But what matters is that I discovered it on my own, but we can always help other people discover it. Not everyone has to go through the ordeals that I had to go through, for example. They can skip that. Furthermore, I object to the characterization of the free software expert as some sort of a weirdo, even if you put a positive spin to it. So the good weirdo. I object to that. Remember that we are talking about liberty, about autonomy, and a life that is characterized by an ethos of discipline, in the sense that I alluded to earlier. So not conformity, but of being in control. This is not weird. This is not weirdness. It is about realizing your potential, about being yourself. It is about tearing apart that cobweb of induced helplessness and all those rationalizations that keep you subservient to forces outside your control, both as an individual and as a member of a wider community. There is a song of an old Greek rock band, which I think is relevant in this discussion, and the song says something along those lines. It's a free translation. What are we even doing here in the other people's night? In Greek is the band is Tripes, that's how they are called, and the title is Τι γυρεύουμε εμείς μέσα στη νύχτα των άλλων. I have it here. If you want, you can copy it and check it out. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is that this is a great metaphor because it leads to my fifth insight, my fifth lesson from my experiences in the computer space, which is do not live under some other person's shadow. Do not use their language or their associations to make sense of the world, because that forces you to vindicate the categories that they assume as constant. You speak in their terms. You think in their terms. Don't do that. So no, I am not a nerd. I am an Emacs user as a consequence of the fact that I want more autonomy. And I am unapologetic about it. I don't need to describe myself to other people as some kind of an eccentric, as some kind of an irregular fellow. I don't need to be apologetic about what I am and what I want. And what I want is autonomy, and what I want is discipline. And I am prepared, and I am fully prepared to deal with the consequences and to cope with the challenges as those arrive. So, in conclusion, Emacs is just another tool. So, my main takeaway from this video blog is that you need to check your mentality and you need to get into the mindset of doing things that give you more control. And this necessarily involves learning by reading, or in my case as well, learning through trial and error. For example, this is specifically true for my programming endeavors, because I always try something, it gives me an error, I tweak it a bit, it gives me another error, I tweak it again, eventually it works, and voila, I am a hacker. I am not. But anyway, so couched in those terms, Emacs will not solve the problems in your life. It will not become your powerhouse of productivity after one weekend's worth of effort. You are willing to commit to Emacs for the long term because you are driven by the spirit of liberty, of controlling your own setup and being very deliberate about how the whole system is pieced together. Now I can almost hear your rationalizations speaking. Oh, but it is too hard. Oh, I am a dummy. Emacs is from yesteryear. It is not relevant anymore. Whatever. You will come up with all sorts of excuses, and you need to stop heeding those calls. They are not your friends. If you set up yourself for failure, you will always think that you are inadequate, that something is wrong with you, because you will always be failing. And then you will say, okay, what is going on? Why am I always failing? Therefore, it's because I am inadequate. That's what you will think. And your mind will play along with that game, whispering to you, as it were, that you are all those things, that you are an idiot, that you are inadequate, etc. And that you deserve to remain in that inert state, in stasis. You have to stay there. No. What my journey as a computer user has taught me, and what Emacs rendered crystal clear, is that you will always think that you are an idiot for as long as you remain heteronymous. Things will begin changing once you start moving towards autonomy, once you start making steps towards that direction. In my case, that took a few years. It is a gradual process, which I think has made me a competent computer user as well as a better person. Of course, what I have described here, what I have mentioned here, is not the beginning and the end towards gaining autonomy. These are about magnitudes that we control. For example, in the computer space, we control this space, so we can enact reform unilaterally on our own. We can enact reform. Of course, there are other issues in our life. There are systemic or structural magnitudes that we cannot control each of us on our own. So we need concerted effort as communities in order to enact change, in order to enact reform. But of course, we must always start from somewhere. And if we can gain at least a kernel of autonomy in our life, in our computing life, at least we already have tasted freedom, and we will want more of it, so we can communicate this spirit, this enthusiasm for freedom. We can communicate it with others as well, and perhaps we can make things happen in our world. We can institute reform. So, to recapitulate. 1. Without knowledge, you are trapped in a cycle of self-deprecation and perceived powerlessness. So seek knowledge. 2. You must always assess someone on their own merits instead of some other person's standards. Do not fall into the trap of Tina. There is no alternative. Do not fall into that trap, because there always is an alternative. It is about your mindset. This is what is blocking progress. 3. Autonomy comes at a cost. You must be prepared to forego some short-term comfort, some short-term productivity in order to prepare yourself for gaining control. You have to take a step back, reassess how things stand, and then push forward with determination. And this presupposes discipline. And as I mentioned before, discipline is not conformism. 4. Be modest, patient, persistent, and courageous. In practical terms, understand that there is no shortcut to gaining expertise. There is no magic way to become wise or to become an expert in any given field. For software in particular, this means that you must always read the documentation. Never sidestep that, never circumvent this step. This is the most important step, the most important skill as a free software user, and this is something, of course, that Emacs embodies, this documentation culture that Emacs has, and I am proud of it, and I am happy that it exists, because it really helps you learn, it really helps you keep learning and be in this process of self-education. So, do not forget to read the docs. 5. Do not live under another person's shadow, as the song says, in the night of the others. Do not play along with their role games. Do not vindicate their narratives and provide assent to their presumptions. So this is all I had to say for you folks. With those in mind, you will be prepared to use free software in general and GNU Emacs in particular. I think my experience tells me that in doing so, you will effectively upgrade yourself. You will be a much better person than what you were when you got started with it. It will change your life. And of course, as I said, it is not the end of a process. It is just the beginning of a new cycle towards more autonomy and more liberty and more control. And then you will want to make that spread to your community and so on. So it does not stop here. It is Emacs is not the end of the world. So that's all I have to say for you folks. That was the presentation. As I said, this is a plain text file. This is just org mode notation. So I will add this text as it is. I will just copy it below the video. It will be on my website. If you are watching this on the video hosting platform, I will provide the link to my website in the description, where you can find this. And of course everything else that I write, which is not limited to Emacs. So that's all for now folks. I have been talking for a while. I'm not sure for how long, maybe close to an hour, maybe a bit less. I have no idea. I didn't take time. But anyway, that's all I had to say. So thank you very much for your attention folks, and see you next time. Take care. Goodbye.